Hello class, welcome to the mid-semester review. It was brought to my attention that I accidentally misspoke during the last lecture. I have it in my notes that this lecture was supposed to be posted today on March 3rd, and I accidentally said during last week's lecture that it would be up by the end of last week. So my apologies with that oversight. Anyway, your midterm exam will be opened on Thursday of this week, and you will have 1 week to complete that exam. Now that doesn't mean that you can go back and forth to the exam intermittently. You have to dedicate a set of time so that you can complete the exam in one sitting. You will have 3 hours to complete the exam, which is more than enough time. And so, yeah, you open the exam and you take it start to finish, and then you're done. But you have 1 week to do that. So that's what I mean by it. It's confusing. It's going to be open for a week, but you have 3 hours to take it. All right. So I'm going to talk more about the specifics of the exam at the end of this review, but I just want to kind of get things rolling with a very cursory look at the chronology of our semester thus far. All the images have been taken out of the context of the lectures, and they're here presented in chronological order. So you can see very specifically how painting developed, because art history books, my lectures, are designed to tell a specific story, but the course of history tells another kind of story, or the course of time, rather. History is the story, time is just the facts. So, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres' Grand Odalisque set the stage for our course this term. She is an elongated, idealized female nude. She is presented for the visual consumption of a male patronage, a male viewership. There are elements to this painting that are symbolic of Ingres' knowledge of the broader world outside of France. These are themes that continue to come up in the course of the paintings that we've looked at. And so really quickly, we're just going to walk through some of these things. So here we have the elongated female figure, but instead of being put in front of the audience for the viewer's consumption, she confronts the audience by looking outwardly at them. And this is Edouard Manet's Olympia, painted in 1863, so sometime after Ingres' completion of the Grand Odalisque. But because of Edouard Manet's proximity to the Academy, or the École des Beaux-Arts, we know that he was familiar with Ingres' teaching. He was probably very familiar with the Grand Odalisque, and this painting was made in retaliation against that kind of academic styling. Now, we also talked about how this painting embodied what was indicative of a new kind of painting tradition, and that is the staccato brushwork. So not only are we seeing stylistic changes, but we're also seeing actual physical changes in the way that artists are engaging with their material. It's not surprising that some of the earlier works take some of the same forms. Now, there are other works from 1866 that I could have picked. There are other Courbet paintings that I could have picked, but there is a nice trajectory to the course of this history, because what these four paintings are doing, and there is a fourth here, what these four paintings are doing is setting up a nice way for you to understand how history, or how you can cater history to tell specific stories. So there's lots of other paintings that I could have shown from this time period, but I specifically chose ones that had the same subject matter because it makes a nice through line. It's curating, as it were. So this is Gustave Courbet's Woman with Parrot from 1866. Here we have a female nude, elongated, put out there for the viewer's consumption. Here, however, instead of this confrontational face that we have in Manet's Olympia, we have a woman who is very relaxed and very at ease, and And Gustave Courbet, the famed realist, is here saying that Manet claimed that his Olympia was more real than the odalisques of the past, and Courbet is saying actually this is what a courtesan looks like. He's a very blunt man. And then of course we get to Paul Cézanne, who in 1870 gave us this. Now in lecture I gave a very specific reading of this painting. I talked about it in relationship to the three prior works, but not just as a continuation of a theme, but a pointed critique of the entire system. Review the lectures for more on that. This series of images put together here in a nice GIF for us is of Edward Muybridge's Horse Galloping. Now I talked about this as being a scientific exercise structured around a bet between two well-to-do gentlemen in California, and Muybridge set up a string of cameras that captured the image of a horse galloping by after the horse tripped a wire. And we have 12 of those images here. And the reason why I'm stopping here in a trajectory of the history of painting is to say that this series of images presents a really wonderful way of understanding how the world at this time was changing very drastically. Not only do we have the comfortable use of the photographic media, we're not just seeing the development of photography, which I didn't talk about in this course. We're seeing it at this very comfortable stage. Photographers are not thinking about the magic of photography, they're thinking about the practicality of it. So there's this functional situation that's going on here, and that's because of industrialization. So we have the industrialization of the world, and it ruptures painting. And as the next series of paintings that we're going to talk about show you, it's a different course that history goes on after industrialization and after people get comfortable with their cameras. So in this this industrializing world, we're not post-industrial yet, in this industrializing world, we have painters that turn an introspective lens. And so we have female painters for the first time getting fame and recognition, excuse me. We have Berthe Morisot painting The Cradle in 1872. But we also have Claude Monet, who goes out into this new industrial world and gives us a rendering of one of the newest structures in downtown Paris, the Gare Saint-Lazare, which is one of the larger train stations in downtown Paris, which you all know because I've mentioned that in lecture before. Here we have a slightly different take on the society after the industry takes hold, and we have Georges Pierre Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jacques from 1886. And here, as we talked about in lecture, he's giving us a very placid and intentionally placid take on what Parisian life was at that time. He's taken the chaos out and allowed us the ability, us being the contemporary viewer at this time, the person who sees this image in 1887, say, when it's on public exhibition, it's those people that see this as an idyllic landscape. Paul Gauguin gives us a different kind of idealism in this image, where instead of it being a fictive idealism, he gives us kind of a psychological idealism. So we have the image of Breton women in the west coast of France that have left the chapel after a sermon, and they are kind of all wrought with the same, wrougught's the wrong word, they're all hit with the same image, and that image is of the topic of the sermon, which was Jacob wrestling with the angel. And so these people, these very devout people, they look upon this scene, but they're mentally picturing it, and that's a different kind of idealism. And even the way that the Breton society relates to the industrial society is an idealized structure for Gauguin. Gauguin left Paris because he was Les Miserables, like that self-portrait I showed you. And, he left because he was miserable because of industrialization, and he went to a part of the country where he found people that seemed to be pre-industry or not of industry, and he idealized them. And here we have the idealized representation of this society. Paul Sérusier gave us the Le Talisman in 1888, that same year. He is painting out of doors or en plein air, and while he's doing that under the guidance of Paul Gauguin, he is instructed to, or advised to, just use whatever color comes to him. And so he was given to a little bit of whimsy and a little bit of freedom, and let his hand make both arbitrary but pointed representation of the landscape that he saw before him. So as I said in lecture, this is actually a recognizable landscape. There are items that are reflected in a body of water that is before the painter, and you have the trees on the opposite bank, and that is what this image is of. So the colors are what is expressive. There's not that much idealism in this work necessarily, other than it becomes, a talisman or a token of a promise of a better future for painting. There's a big sense of idealism in Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. There's hope. Hope's a kind of idealism, right? So there's hope for this world that Van Gogh sees out of his window in this image. Hope for kind of a majesty and a magic in the night sky. It's hope because his life is very wrought, and so it's like Seurat's image of the urban sphere. Van Gogh's image is also kind of removing a bit of the stress to allow some of the majesty to pour out. Kind of following in line with Paul Sérusier and a little bit with Georges-Pierre Seurat, we have Henri Matisse's Le Bonheur de Vivre, or The Joy of Life, from 1906. Here we have the free association of color. At this time, we're so far beyond where Paul Sérusier was that painters could just do this pretty freely, and they did it so freely that a group of them actually came together because they needed to come together to form an exhibition, an exhibiting group, an exhibiting collective, like the Impressionists were seen as, and the press referred to them, of course, as, I hope all of you know, the Fauves, the wild beasts, because they were so tenacious with their selection of color and the way that they represented the world that they wanted to see. This is not an image that Matisse is looking at. Go back to this image, and we have something that Seurat is looking at. He is looking at the modern world, and he removes a little bit of the grit and the grime from it. We have a similar thing, but there's a little bit more melancholy in there, but it's still the world that Van Gogh is looking at, but some of the stuff is removed. This is totally fictive. This is an imagined space. So at this point, painters are so comfortable with the idea of industrialization that they don't need to render a landscape that's before them. They can make one up because the landscape before them is not thought of in the same way that Seurat thought about it, or that Van Gogh thought about it, or Ingres, or any previous painter where the land meant something very different to the person who is born in the era of trains. Also an idealized landscape, also a fictive scene, also a scene that gives us this sense of, I always think about this painting in relationship to industrialization in the same way that I think about this painting in the same way. It's, in the face of all this industry, artists are going into their imagination to create these landscapes that they can't even imagine existing in the real world. Seurat was able to just modify what he saw because he had an understanding of a placid urban situation. But by the time we get to Cezanne, it's totally different. Or Cezanne at this time, because he had a very prolific career. Anyway, so Cezanne's large bathers, also from 1806. You know, in lecture I talked much more about this as a formal object, or as an object of pigment, binder, canvas, wood stretchers. And so here I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a sense of how all this stuff strings together as one grand chronology. Fitting right in perfectly, I think, you know, with these three works, is Picasso's volley into this same arena. But Picasso had a much more kind of crass way of dealing with the world around him, that he didn't give us these nudes that were in this place that didn't really exist, or, you know, a group of commingled bodies around a landscape that doesn't exist. He names the place where these people are, and he gives them a sense of a profession. Now, I referenced these 5 people as being the women of Avignon, or as the title says, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. That implies that they are prostitutes. The scene around them implies, because of the curtains, that's how brothels were structured back in the day. You would walk into a room, curtains would be around, and there would be women for you to select, and then you go up to your room. So that's recognizable. And so Picasso was saying that, you know, this idealism is found in these kinds of spaces where, sure, the reality is that you're going with a courtesan, but you can imagine that courtesan to be any variety that you want, whatever your fancy is. You know, whether it be this kind of representation of a female body or this kind of representation of a female body. In painting, as the painter and as the idealist painter, you get to choose. And so Picasso is saying, like, instead of choosing all of them being the same, why not make them all different and give you actually the kind of an index of your options? And of course, if he's playing with non-Western traditions, you know, the masks from sub-Saharan Africa and that kind of material. So all of that's important to think about, but just putting it in the sweep of things. It's funny how these things kind of hash out. You know, when you talk about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, it doesn't seem to have that much proximity to futurism, but yet in its chronology, it's actually fairly close. You know, Picasso didn't really show many people Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1907. Giacomo Balla did display this work, the Streetlight, in Italy in 1910. It actually was shown almost before, this was probably completed before Marinetti published the Futurist Manifesto in Le Figaro. In another part of Europe, idealism is still engaged with, and this kind of nudes in the landscape is engaged with, but in a more upfront and honest sense. Kirchner, instead of thinking of a fictive place, as Matisse is here, he's thinking of a place in his memory, and each of these people are duplicates of those friends that he was with. So in other words, he would go to the swimming hole multiple times with a few friends, like 2 friends. But here he's compiled all of those memories into one. So his idealism is rooted in his history, not necessarily in fiction or in just the ideal painting. Also from 1910, we have the Futurist work by Umberto Boccioni, The City Rises. (1911) sees Vasily Kandinsky's composition number 4. This one's dealt with in your text. And here we have Georges Braque's Le Portugese from 1911. And you see how kind of quickly things change drastically. So we go from, having this kind of abstraction develop, having this kind of abstraction develop, and then really quickly we have this kind of abstraction developing. So there's a lot of different people that are doing a lot of different kinds of research in a lot of different parts of Europe at the same time. But they're all happening kind of in these little nodes that exist independent of each other. And then just when you think you have a handle on it, you throw in America, and you've got Arthur Dove's Nature Symbolized. So that's a lot of different kinds of abstraction to be going on right around the same time. The Cubists go one way, and they give us a collage. The Americans continue to grapple with European abstraction, and so by 1912, we have American artists who deals in France quite a bit, Marcel Duchamp, giving us a work that's very preoccupied with trying to understand Cubism. Sculptural forms made in excitingly new ways. And then the war kicks off, right? And everything begins to change. And here in this kind of intermediary phase around the war, or during the war, art's in this flux period. And so Marsden Hartley's Portrait of a German Officer gives us, it's kind of like there's a bunch of strands of culture that are coming together, and the war happens and some knots get tied, but there are some loose ends that kind of are left dangling. This is an example of one of those. This kind of portraiture that's based in the symbol goes away during the war. Just isn't one of the aesthetic the aesthetic languages that survives. This kind of confusion of Cubism and also goes away. And so Max Weber, and this is very interesting that a lot of American painters, they're bringing aesthetics back, but they're only bringing back certain aspects of it. And so they don't actually, it's like taking a bit of a plant but not having enough material to actually grow another successful harvest of that plant. You know, you just, it's gonna end. So ultimately, suprematism, I mean, it does come up as an influence, but it doesn't go that far. It doesn't have that strong of legs to stand on. Kazimir Malevich's Black Square from 1915. You know, this painting that's devoid of a painting, that's devoid of content. What does that mean? That's yet another aesthetic language that kind of disappears. Evidence of Dadaism is first seen in the 1916-1917 collage by Hans Arp. We talked about how this is claimed to have been arranged according to the laws of chance, but how improbable that reality actually is. Dadaism is one of the strands of artistic thinking that survives the war. It does so because it's born during the war in the very center by a group of international people. And when the war ends and those people go home, they all take a bit of Dada with them. In Germany, it turns into a very politically scathing rhetoric of collage-based image making. Like here, Hannah Hawks cut with a kitchen knife through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany. I almost got through that without stuttering. Almost. It's tough. You should try it. And later in 1920, we have Otto Dix giving us the Scat Players, which, as I said in the lecture, is actually a collage. There are elements of external culture that are brought onto the canvas. Which ones are they? But the thing that actually stops a lot of those other painting styles, I mean, in Russia it's kind of tough because Malevich proclaimed this, and then there was a successive revolution, and politics got in the way of his aesthetic symbolism. You know, that's why this kind of culture ended. After the war, painters like Max Weber and Marsden Hartley realized different kind of painting styles. They exhibited in a similar fashion to European artists, a kind of return to order. Now, how that manifests itself well beyond the end of the war is in this kind of work, where there's an acute sense of painterly control. We understand the visuals of this painting by Max Ernst. We get it. The images confuse us, but we can ultimately make sense of the kinds of images that are collaged together here. Now, of course, it isn't a collage, it's all painting, of course, right? But it has all of these things that come out of Dada and the introduction of the collage but that come also out of a return to order, where painting is privileged again as a classical tradition, not just as something seen of rebellion or of aesthetic analysis. And that's why we have works like this from 1928, where you have kind of a concrete environment. We understand the architecture that these two figures exist in. We understand the shapes of their bodies. We even understand a little bit about their cultural significance as bodies, one being male, one being female, or at least in the clothing of. But it's confused us because it has these veils over their faces. And so the kind of the chants or the idiotic that was privileged during the Dada period is more processed, thought of differently, and given to us in this format, which is an internal examination of our reality. So there's quite a bit of variance in the course of where we've come so far, and that's to be expected, right? So go back through the slide lectures, quite obviously. Go back through this lecture if you think it will be helpful. And also go back through your text. I am relying on the text for quite a few questions on this exam. And so reading the text, being familiar with the text is going to be helpful because obviously I'm not in the room with you, so it is by all accounts an open book test. That said, do not use the internet to help you with this exam. Don't do it. Use your text, use your notes, use those two things. If you try to use the internet, you're going to lose track of time and you're going to get waylaid and you're not going to complete the exam. It happens a lot during the midterm. By the final, most people figure it out, but by the midterm, I usually have a few students that do poorly on this exam because they're trying to Wikipedia everything. Do not do that. So, the test is broken up in 4 different categories. There's going to be true-false questions, slide identification questions, where you have to identify the artist, the title, and the date of the work. And the date is plus or minus 5 years. So, multiple choice, and then essay. There's going to be 1 essay question for you to answer. I'm going to give you 2 options for that essay, and then you have to include 4 works of art. You actually have to talk about 4 works of art in your response. You pick 1 essay question, you give me 1 answer. You don't have to answer both questions. I'm just giving you an option in case you know one thing more thoroughly than the other. On the final exam, you get 4 options because it's more cumulative. So, we're nearing a half an hour. I'm going to wrap this lecture up, or this review up, and just say that on Thursday, everything's going to go live with the midterm. I wish you all a happy and safe spring break, and when we reconvene after the break, we're going to reconvene after the break, and we're going to talk about what happens after Surrealism, because a lot of stuff happens, because that's only 1928, everybody. Cool. Good luck studying. And thank you, Deb, for pointing out my error. Whoops. I'm really sorry about that, guys.